The rain does not wash the city clean. It merely slicks the grime into a darker shade of gray, reflecting the neon hemorrhaging from the liquor stores and the all-night pawn shops, where desperation is the only currency that never inflates. We stand at the precipice of understanding, looking down into the abyss of the human archives, and we fool ourselves into believing that the library is a sanctuary of preservation. We tell ourselves that the university is a fortress of inquiry, where no question is too dangerous and no hypothesis is too sharp to handle. This is the great lie, the foundational myth of the intellectual world. The truth is far colder and far more mechanical. The academy is not a vault. It is a filter. It is a vast, intricate immune system designed not to protect the truth, but to protect the host organism from truths that are toxic to its survival. Tonight, we are going to walk past the velvet ropes and the tenure committees and the peer review boards that act as the gatekeepers of our collective sanity. We are going to descend into the basement levels of the intellectual edifice, down where the ventilation hums with a sick, rattling cough and the fluorescent lights flicker with the frequency of a dying nervous system. We are going to examine 3 specific case studies, 3 moments in history where a thought experiment was not merely debunked or argued against, but actively excised, cut out like a tumor, and incinerated in the furnace of institutional silence. These are not conspiracy theories, born in the fever dreams of the paranoid, but rigorous mathematical and sociological models that reached conclusions so catastrophic to the social order that they had to be unmade. The first of these buried traumas takes us back to the winter of 1973, to a concrete building on the edge of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the air smelled of stale coffee and burning ozone from the mainframe computers that were just beginning to dream in binary. Enter Dr. Elias Vance. He was not a man of charisma, he was a man of numbers, a statistician who saw the world not as a collection of souls, but as a series of probability curves interacting in a closed system. Vance was interested in the architecture of consensus. He wanted to understand how a society agrees on what is true and what is false. He built a simulation, a model of democratic decision-making that was intended to prove the resilience of the open society. He fed the machine variables regarding education, empathy, media saturation, and resource scarcity. He expected the model to show that over time, a free exchange of ideas would lead to an equilibrium of truth, a marketplace where the best ideas rose to the top like cream. He ran the simulation once, and the machine spat out a result that made no sense. He assumed it was a coding error, a ghost in the machine. He spent 3 weeks debugging the fortitude of his algorithms, sleeping on a cot in his office, ignoring the calls from his wife and the warnings from the department head, who told him he was wasting valuable processor time. He ran it again. The result was identical. The model did not predict a marketplace of ideas. It predicted a phenomenon Vance called the inevitability of the noise floor. The experiment demonstrated mathematically that as the volume of information in a society increases, the ability of the population to process that information decreases inversely until a critical threshold is reached. At this threshold, the human mind stops evaluating data based on logic or evidence and switches entirely to tribal heuristics and emotional resonance. The terrifying conclusion of the Vance Protocol was that in a sufficiently advanced information society, truth does not just become obscure, it becomes an evolutionary disadvantage. The model showed that the entities most efficient at spreading influence were those unburdened by the constraints of reality, because reality is complex and boring, while fabrication is simple and exciting. Vance watched in horror as his simulated society did not move toward enlightenment, but spiraled inevitably toward a state of maximum polarization, followed by total systemic collapse. The math proved that democracy was not a stable state, but a transitional phase, a brief candle flickering between the darkness of tyranny and the chaos of anarchy. The most dangerous aspect of his finding was the variable of empathy. He discovered that as information density grew, empathy became a finite resource that was rapidly depleted. To survive the onslaught of data, the individuals in his simulation had to shut down their capacity for nuance. They had to become soldiers in a war of narratives. When Vance presented his preliminary findings to the faculty board, the room did not erupt in debate. It went silent. The silence was not one of awe, but of recognition. They saw the monster in the math. They realized that if this paper were published, if it were accepted as a valid description of the sociopolitical trajectory, it would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It would validate the worst instincts of the demagogues and the totalitarians. The department chair, a man who had fled the ruins of Europe 30 years prior, took Vance aside and told him that some truths are too heavy for the human structure to bear. The funding was pulled the following week. The magnetic tapes containing the simulation data were demagnetized, a ritualistic cleansing of the digital soul. Vance was transferred to a satellite campus in the Midwest, where he taught introductory statistics to bored undergraduates until he died of a heart attack in 1992. His papers were boxed and shoved into the back of a storage locker, a cardboard coffin for an idea that could have ended the world or perhaps saved it by warning us of the cliff edge we were racing toward. But the silence of the archive is not empty. It is heavy with the weight of what is missing. As we leave the dusty legacy of Elias Vance, we must understand that the suppression of the noise floor theory was an act of mercy, or so the system believed. It was the immune system attacking a pathogen. But the second experiment we must unearth is not sociological, it is biological, and it strikes much closer to the bone. It challenges the very seat of our consciousness, the pilot in the cockpit of the skull. We move forward in time to the late 80s, to a neurological research facility in Zurich, hidden behind the sterile facade of a pharmaceutical conglomerate. Here, we find a team of neuroscientists led by a woman named Dr. Elena Corves. She was mapping the delay between sensory input and conscious perception. It is a well-known fact in neuroscience that there is a lag, a tiny fraction of a second between when your eye sees the light and when your brain tells you that you have seen it. We live in the past. We are always trailing reality by a few hundred milliseconds. Corves wanted to close the gap. She wanted to find the mechanism of the conscious will, the spark that decides to move the hand before the hand moves. She designed an experiment involving direct cranial stimulation and a predictive algorithm that could read the preparatory potential of the motor cortex. What she found was the second dangerous idea. She discovered that the conscious mind, the voice in your head that says, "I am doing this," does not actually initiate action. The action begins deep in the subconscious machinery of the brain, long before you are aware of it. The sensation of will, the feeling of agency, is a post hoc rationalization. It is a story the brain tells itself after the fact to claim credit for something the biological machine has already done. Corves realized that we are not the drivers of the vehicle. We are the passengers, staring at a dashboard of disconnected dials, believing we are steering while the car drives itself on a dark highway. This is known as the illusion of the executive function. When she pushed the experiment further, attempting to use magnetic stimulation to override the subconscious veto, she found something even more disturbing. She found that when the illusion of free will is broken, when the subject is forced to confront the mechanical nature of their own actions, the mind does not accept it. It breaks. The subjects in her study began to experience a dissociation so profound it mimicked the symptoms of Cotard delusion, the belief that one is dead or does not exist. They looked in the mirror and saw a meat puppet. They looked at their hands and saw hydraulic clamps of bone and sinew, moving according to a script written by chemistry and electricity. The terror of this realization was absolute. It suggested that self-awareness is not a higher state of being, but a parasite, a glitch in the software that causes suffering by creating the illusion of a self that can suffer. If the findings of the Corves study were released, it would dismantle the basis of law, of morality, of religion. If we are not the authors of our actions, how can we be judged? If we are merely observers of a biological play, how can we love or hate? The implications were a solvent that would dissolve the glue holding civilization together. The pharmaceutical company that funded the research saw a liability. They saw lawsuits. They saw a public relations nightmare that would make them the architects of nihilism. The project was terminated. The subjects were paid handsomely for their silence and their therapy. Dr. Corves was offered a position in administrative oversight, a golden handcuff deal that ensured she would never touch a lab instrument again. She spent the rest of her life gardening, tending to plants that grew and turned toward the sun without the burden of believing they had chosen to do so. She often wondered in her private journals if the plants were happier than the humans because they did not suffer the delusion of the captaincy. The silence surrounding the Corves findings is a thick velvet curtain drawn across a window that looks out onto a void. We prefer the curtain. We prefer the lie that we are in control. But the third experiment, the final buried trauma, is the most visceral of all, because it does not deal with the abstract society or the internal mind, but with the physical reality of survival. It brings us to the threshold of the new millennium, to a think tank funded by energy conglomerates and military strategists, deeply buried in the neurotic heart of Washington, D.C. The year is 1999. The fear of the millennium bug is a distraction from the real rot in the floorboards. The project was codenamed the Leviathan Calculation. It was an interdisciplinary effort involving geologists, economists, and game theorists. Their task was to model the long-term viability of altruism in a resource-scarce environment. We are taught that cooperation is the key to evolutionary success, that humans conquered the planet because we learned to work together, to share the fire and the meat. The Leviathan team built a model that projected resource depletion curves forward by 200 years, overlapping them with climate volatility and population density. They wanted to find the tipping point where cooperation breaks down. They expected to find that cooperation would strain, but ultimately hold as the most efficient strategy for collective survival. The computer cluster hummed for weeks, crunching data on water tables, soil erosion, and hydrocarbon reserves. The answer that came back was the third forbidden truth. The model proved that past a certain point of scarcity, altruism ceases to be a survival strategy and becomes a suicide pact. The Leviathan calculation demonstrated that in a high-scarcity environment, the optimal survival strategy for any localized group is immediate and total aggression. Preemptive elimination of competitors was not merely an option, it was the only mathematical path to securing a future. The model showed that groups who attempted to share, rationing resources, or negotiate, found themselves depleted and overrun by groups who adopted a policy of maximum ruthlessness. The disturbing part was the speed of the transition. The shift from civilized cooperation to total war did not happen gradually, it happened overnight. It was a phase change, like water turning to ice. One day the neighbors are borrowing sugar. The next day they are barricading the doors and sharpening the garden tools. The report concluded that our current civilization is not a solid structure, but a thin film of oil floating on a deep ocean of violence, held in place only by the temporary abundance of cheap energy. When the energy becomes expensive, the film breaks. The generals and the CEOs who commissioned the study read the executive summary in a soundproof briefing room. They looked at the charts that showed the jagged red lines of population collapse. They looked at the maps that predicted which zones would become deadlands and which would become fortresses. They realized that if this information became public, it would trigger the very collapse it predicted. If people knew that the math favored the ruthless, they would become ruthless preemptively to avoid being the victims. The report was classified top secret. It was buried deeper than the nuclear launch codes. The scientists were reassigned to benign projects, studying algae blooms and traffic patterns. But the knowledge remained in the heads of the men who sat in that room. It changed the way they looked at the world. It changed the way they planned for the future. They stopped building bridges and started building bunkers. These three experiments, the Vance Protocol, the Corves Study, and the Leviathan Calculation, form an unholy trinity of forbidden knowledge. They are the thoughts that the system cannot think without destroying itself. They suggest that our democracy is a noise machine destined to deafen us, that our free will is a comforting hallucination, and that our morality is a luxury of abundance that will evaporate with the last drop of oil. To speak of them is to invite the gaze of the immune system, to feel the cold touch of the censorship that calls itself discretion. But we are here in the dark now, and the eyes have adjusted. We can see the outlines of the buried shapes. We can feel the heat radiating from the incinerator of history. The question is not whether these experiments were true. The question is whether we are strong enough to live with the answers, or if we too will reach for the shovel and help pile the dirt back onto the graves of these dangerous ideas. The narrative of human progress is written in ink, but it is edited in bleach. We look at the smooth white pages of our history books, and we see a story of ascent. We see the triumph of reason over superstition, of liberty over tyranny, of science over ignorance. But if you hold those pages up to the light, if you look at the texture of the paper, you can see the scuff marks where the text was rubbed away. You can see the shadow of the words that were deemed too sharp for the public eye. The academy, the media, the government, they function as a triumvirate of curation. They cultivate the garden of the mind by pruning the branches that grow in the wrong direction. But who decides the direction? Who holds the shears? It is not a conspiracy of shadowy figures in hooded robes. It is a conspiracy of good intentions. It is the banality of preservation. The dean who wants to keep his grant funding, the editor who wants to avoid a lawsuit, the politician who wants to prevent a panic. They are the bricks in the wall of silence. Let us return to the ghost of Dr. Vance. Imagine him in that satellite campus office, the snow falling outside the window, the radiator clanking in the corner. He is sitting at a metal desk, staring at a stack of graded papers, but his mind is still back in Cambridge, still watching the simulation run. He knows that he has seen the face of the future and that the future is a screaming mouth. He watches the television news and he sees the noise floor rising. He sees the sound bites getting shorter, the arguments getting louder, the nuance evaporating like mist. He sees the polarization that he predicted, the way families are splitting apart over political abstractions, the way neighbors are becoming enemies because they inhabit different reality tunnels. He wants to scream. He wants to run into the street and shake people by the shoulders and tell them that they are variables in an equation that solves for zero. But he stays in his chair. He marks a red X on a student paper. He sips his lukewarm coffee. He understands now that being right is not enough. Being right is a burden. The burden of the Corves Study is even heavier. Imagine the subjects of that experiment, the ones who saw the strings attached to their own limbs. They are walking through the streets of Zurich, a city of clocks and chocolate and order. They see the people rushing to catch the tram. They see the lovers holding hands by the lake. They see the bankers checking their watches. And they see it all as a mechanical ballet. They see the deterministic chains of cause and effect rattling just beneath the skin. They know that the banker did not choose to check his watch, that the lover did not choose to reach for the hand. It was all written in the Big Bang, the grand collision of particles that set the billiard balls of the universe in motion. They feel the crushing weight of the inevitable. They try to pray, but who are they praying to, and who is doing the praying? If the self is an illusion, then the prayer is just a chemical reaction fizzing in the wet gray matter of the brain. The silence of the universe is not empty, it is deafening. And then there are the architects of the Leviathan Calculation. They are not victims, they are the ones holding the keys. They are the men who bought the islands in the Pacific, who built the panic rooms in the Rockies. They do not talk about the experiment at cocktail parties. They smile and discuss the stock market and the golf swing. But behind their eyes, there is a calculation running constantly. They are measuring the distance to the exit. They are assessing the structural integrity of the social contract. They know that the veneer of civilization is micron thin. They have seen the math. They know that when the supply chain breaks, the monster wakes up. The monster is not an external enemy, it is us. It is the reptilian brainstem that has been dormant for 10,000 years, waiting for the hunger to wake it. They look at their children and they wonder if they will be the hunters or the prey. They stock the larder. They reinforce the doors. They wait. We must ask ourselves why we are drawn to these stories, these dark myths of the archives. Is it a morbid curiosity, a desire to see the car crash? Or is it a suspicion that the world we have been sold is a forgery? We feel the dissonance in our bones. We feel the friction between the map and the territory. We are told that we are free, rational agents, living in a benevolent democracy that is slowly marching toward utopia. But we look around and we see the cracks. We feel the noise floor rising. We feel the autopilot taking over. We feel the scarcity creeping in. The buried experiments resonate because they confirm what we suspect in the darkest hours of the night. They tell us that the anxiety we feel is not a pathology, but a rational response to a structural reality. The system is failing, not because it is broken, but because it was never designed to hold this much weight. The narrative flow of our investigation must now turn inward. We have looked at the archives, we have looked at the scientists, we have looked at the concepts. Now we must look at the mechanism of suppression itself. How does an idea get buried? It is rarely a dramatic event. There are no book burnings in the modern university. There are no inquisitors with hot pokers. The censorship is soft. It is bureaucratic. It is a raised eyebrow in a faculty meeting. It is a rejected grant application with a polite note about methodological flaws. It is the silence of the telephone not ringing. It is the career that stalls, the paper that sits in the drawer, the conversation that changes subject when the dangerous topic is breached. It is a consensus of avoidance. We protect one another from the abyss. We agree implicitly to keep the lights on and the curtains drawn. But what happens when the curtains catch fire? What happens when the reality that was repressed returns with a vengeance? The return of the repressed is a concept from psychoanalysis, but it applies to history as well. The truths that Vance and Corves and the Leviathan team uncovered did not cease to exist because they were ignored. The noise floor continued to rise. The biological machinery continued to churn. The resources continued to deplete. By ignoring these dynamics, we surrendered our ability to manage them. We gave up the steering wheel because we were afraid to look at the road. And now we are careening faster and faster, and the windshield is covered in mud. The hypnotic rhythm of the status quo is a lullaby designed to keep us asleep while the house burns. Let us dig deeper into the methodology of the Vance Protocol. The mathematics of it were elegant in their brutality. Vance used a concept called recursive feedback loops to model how information circulates. In a healthy system, negative feedback corrects errors. If you say something false and reality contradicts you, the falsehood dies. But Vance showed that in a hyper-saturated media environment, positive feedback loops dominate. If you say something false but it makes people feel good or angry or validated, the falsehood grows. It gains mass. It attracts gravity. It becomes a planet of its own with its own atmosphere of confirmation bias. The truth, which is often cold and unappealing, cannot compete. It gets ejected from the orbit. This is not a political statement. It is a mechanical one. It is the physics of information. And we see it today in the fragmentation of our shared reality. We are living in the wreckage of the prediction that was silenced in 1974. Consider the neurological implications of the Corves findings again. If we accept that free will is an illusion, does it liberate us or destroy us? There is a school of thought, a dark Gnostic stream that suggests the realization of the illusion is the only true free. If you know you are a machine, you can stop hating yourself for your malfunctions. You can look at the criminal and see a broken toaster rather than a sinful soul. You can look at the tyrant and see a viral program running its course. It is a perspective of absolute compassion, but it is a cold compassion, a clinical detachment that strips the world of its drama and its romance. It turns Shakespeare into a technical manual. It turns the history of human struggle into a bug report. Is it better to live in the warm lie or the cold truth? The Academy decided for us. They chose the warmth. They chose the myth of the hero and the villain, because the alternative was a flat gray plane of cause and effect stretching out to infinity. And the Leviathan Calculation, it forces us to confront the fragility of our altruism. We like to think that we are good because we choose to be good. We think our morality is a solid gold bar in the vault of our souls, but the calculation suggests that our morality is more like a liquid that takes the shape of the container it is in. If the container is a rich, stable society, the morality is generous and kind. If the container is a starving lifeboat, the morality becomes sharp and jagged. It suggests that we are not fixed moral entities, but adaptive organisms. We are nice when it pays to be nice. We are cruel when it pays to be cruel. This is an insult to our vanity. We want to believe we are angels who have fallen, not apes who have risen. The Leviathan finding dragged us back down into the mud and told us that the mud is where we belong, and the mud is where we will return when the lights go out. The investigative lens now widens to encompass the systemic architecture that connects these 3 points. We are looking at a structure of denial. A civilization is defined not just by what it remembers, but by what it actively forgets. We have built a cathedral of forgetting. We have educated a class of priests whose job is to maintain the sanctity of the dogma. The dogma is that we are rational, that we are free, that we are progressing. The heretics are not the ones who worship the devil. The heretics are the ones who do the math. The heretics are the ones who look at the MRI scans. The heretics are the ones who check the oil reserves. They are cast out not because they are wrong, but because they are right in a way that is intolerable. We are walking through the long corridors of the university library at night. The air conditioning is